Frontline action with your old friend, Mr. Snorg. If only our dreams could save the world, Mr. Snorg dreamily addressed someone off camera. His attention was caught by another member of the stage crew and directed towards the camera, which Mr. Snorg turned to without any hesitation or embarrassment. He was an older gentleman, for whom life had required strange medicine to endure and, indeed, prosper. For Mr. Snorg presented nothing less than the model of the modern-day amateur polymath. He had mastered the electric guitar, the art of painting, and the comic strip. He was a novelist, a playwright, a poet, a founding member of the Creatures Collage Street Theater group. And now, experimental statistic, I have added a working knowledge of the German language to my roll call of accomplishments. Mr. Snorg had rather worked himself up and looked eagerly to a monitor to witness the cut to a piece of footage recorded last week of him in conversation with an apparently fluent German speaker. Mr. Snorg passed the woman in the scene a fork with which she stabbed a sausage. The next scene was an older film made near the end of the previous season in which Mr. Snorg portrayed a detective. Who actually hires a private detective? Who has ever hired a private detective? Don demanded. He and his brother sat on either end of a small couch in Mr. Snorg's office. Well, to be honest, any work I do gets involved security. Involves security. And sometimes people want to rent my surveillance equipment. Mr. Snorg played with the end of his tie. Don and Phil exchanged glances. Mr. Snorg, you're not really a detective, are you? Phil asked, leaning forward with a squeak of vinyl. Mr. Snorg, impossibly old, yet possessed of extraordinarily large green pupils, looked at the two men. He had forgotten how to smile a long time ago. No, I'm not. But I'll tell you what, I can do the illustrations for your story, turn it into a graphic novel. I think the project could be quite rewarding. What do you know of our story? Don asked. He glanced at the window. The sky at dusk was visible behind a filing cabinet in a small forest of potted plants. I know that you're on the run. I know that you're after a man called Neshafen Zaril, also known as Christian Moose, and I know that Molek and Muir are not ghosts. Don grinned and glanced at Phil. Keep talking, Don begged. Not here, Mr. Snorg insisted, rising from his flimsy desk. He moved towards the door, motioning the brothers to follow. I have a place I use for discussions such as this. He led them down the hall outside the office to a large, deeply framed and elaborately sculpted door. This is the game room, he drawled in patrician vanity. Don and Phil preceded Mr. Snorg into the room, which had taken the latter years of collecting, planning, and organizing, not to mention the installing, balancing, and arranging to put in order. It was like an exhibit at some second- or third-rate roadside museum devoted to an obscurity. A tiled walkway wound among 4 displays or tableaus on staid pedestals of polished wood. Against the far wall itself a tableau, with big mirrors in the 1970s disco bicentennial roller skate revival theme, were the seating areas for guests. After all, it is a game room, Mr. Snorg insisted, grinning broadly. He seemed much younger now. He was like a man who has always put on that he was ancient, but in this light was revealed as an actor. Don and Phil looked at each display in turn. One was a nature scene, feral deer in plaid wool attacking a tiny jet plane full of tiny screaming people. The next showed a man lying on his side, clutching the shredded ends of his exploded stomach, the contents of which were thrown out in a flood of milky glue, rope, string, hair, wood chips, buttons, snipped ends of frankfurters, and whole chunks of astronomical machinery. Another display was a series of glossy black tubes twisted and knotted into a city-sized interstellar floater. Sheets of opaque metal filaments stretched across large gaps in the arrangement. These would not only collect energy borne on the cosmic winds, but would serve as the ship's multisensory apparatus. And the last of these large tableaux, Mr. Snorg introduced the fourth display. This is a depiction of you two. Oh, he walked about the tall sculpture group. It's not realistic, of course, and it doesn't show you as you are now. The old actor nodded with a grin at Don and Phil. Those ridiculous disguises, he shook his head. Are you trying to hide even from yourself? He looked directly at Don. You are Toadskabot, aren't you? He asked as his smile fell into a rictus of interrogatory terror. Who? Don wrinkled his brow to ask. It's you, Mr. Snorg was emphatic. He pulled out a weapon. In shape, it was a tennis ball or two pressed into the base of a South American root vegetable, the whole thing covered with multicolored buttons and mounted with a convenient pistol grip handle and trigger. No, I am Toadskabot. Phil stepped forward, declaration forthright. Doesn't matter, Mr. Snork sneered, firing the weapon. Don threw out a line from his watch dynamo, but it only momentarily slowed down Mr. Snork. Don was forced to tackle him, using his crude bulk to overman his adversary. Moving with surprising speed, Don rendered Mr. Snork defenseless and incapacitated for immediate retaliation. Don was then able to check on Phil. "Are you okay?" he asked, bending over his friend. "No," said Phil. It was the last thing he ever said. However, after I removed his mask and revealed Jerry's strangely blank features, he did say one more thing. "What is the dominant metaphor for man in the minds of Europeans as opposed to Americans?" "Oh, Jerry," I cried, shaking my friend by his floppy little shoulders. "I don't know. I don't know." Colonel Rarities, in order of their treehouse guile. The old jukebox in the corner started up, playing Red Exposure by Chrome. I frowned. I turned to the dormant Snorg with a snarl. I jerked him over and bit his nose cleanly off. It tasted like cheap plastic. I threw him to the ground as gases of vital potency escaped out of his uncovered nasal passages. He was dead. As I concluded my narrative, I folded my hands on my lap, palms up, which I read in a magazine as an unconscious gesture of honesty. "You never say whether you swallow the nose or not when you tell that story," Lance Ash commented, earning a titter among the cognoscenti among the studio audience. "Yes, we were on a television interview program from the mid to late 70s, a sort of Dick Cavett-like hour of talk that wouldn't have been out of place on a public television station in those young, impressionable days. A young boy in a culturally benighted, economically blighted South, one of his few sources of later weirdness is the local PBS station, Channel 8, we called it." "Ah, 8, the oddball number," Tozgabod noted. "Yes, the stuff they had on back then. Not the main features so much, but the off-shows, the stuff at odd hours. It was a feast of strange life for somebody in my situation." "So you credit television more than books with your initial drive towards a cultural aesthetic?" "Well, I don't know about cultural, but yes, it was the biggest influence, surely. But the books were there. Those handful, along with select ones from the Dr. Seuss group, I think are essential in the development of my specific visual orientation." Tozgabod bit his fingernail and looked up into the rigging. "Yeah, the thing about the nose is that it was false. When I said it tasted like cheap plastic, I meant to indicate that it is in fact what it was, and therefore no, I did not swallow it." He glanced at someone off camera and turned back to his audience. "I have been told that we must break for an inducement of some sort. We'll be right back with Lance Ash." Cut to a well-made commercial featuring Tozgabod walking around the fourth tableau in Mr. Snork's game room. A voice over by someone with a voice like Iggy Pop. "He sees only what he wants to see. He only wants to see what he dreamed the night before." This is the Micronauts Play Fortress, a complete playset including 3 action figures plus one surprise. One of the two young boys in the demonstration footage announced with a cry, "The whole mountain is a robot!" "Okay, that's quite enough of that," Lance Ash firmly addressed some electronically scattered entity of hostile intent. "I don't know who's messing about, but," he wagged his finger at the camera, "you're going to get it." Lance Ash smiled broadly, and, he hoped, in the tradition of Letterman-style goofiness. "We're back with my guest, Mr. Tozgabod. Is it just Tozgabod? Is that your real name?" "No, of course not. Not if you... Well, I don't want to get into that, but yes, I have a full name." He paused. "It's Michael Tozgabod, rectangular." He glanced about a little nervously, as if he had exhibited his penis to strangers for the first time. Lance Ash smiled with liberal acceptance. "You were going to tell us something about what you saw when you examined the fourth tableau of Mr. Snorg." "The fourth tableau of Mr. Snorg," Tozgabod repeated in a spooky voice. "It sounds like a horror movie, doesn't it?" "I believe someone is making a film with that title. How close it comes to the original in intent remains to be seen." "You're very intelligent, aren't you?" Tozgabod hunched down and accused. "I'm very literate," admitted Lance Ash. "Word-rich, word-tight, but it's not what is closest to me." "What are you closest to?" Lance Ash smiled and sat forward in his brown, fuzzy mushroom chair. Most of the audience had gone home, and only the most loyal of the crew still manned the cameras. Lights were necessarily dimmed. "We're supposed to be talking about you," he reminded Tozgabod. "Yeah," Tozgabod smiled. What was that last display on the wooden pedestal? What was it?" "It was myself playing with my imaginary friend as a child." "What, like dummies, animatronics, a hologram?" "He used to call me Mike. It was a joke." "How do you get on without him?" "What, I don't mean to sound ruthless, sentimental as I am, but since Jerry continues on in other forms..." Lance Ash interrupted. "Are we talking about the film now?" "No." Tozgabod shook his head in irritation. How stupid was this guy? Specifically the comic strip, if you want to put a category of existence to it. "Are you going to be lonely?" Toadswood looked grinning into the silhouetted figures in the darkened studio. I'll get along, he promised. The end. Bonus materials. That is the formal end of the book. Now follows some supplemental material compiled from sources stretching back to my confused and confusing student days. This is in the tradition of Cortázar, only I'm not going to scramble up my chapters in a cheap gimmick. I mean, come on. Writing alone, naked, out there on the brink of nothing to write. They want to know how I get along without Jerry now that he's dead and can't come back into the book anymore. I tell them that it's okay. He's not really dead. He's only dead in novelistic fiction type form. In my comic strip and maybe one day paintings, Jerry lives on. However, that being said, he is dead here in the book. As such, I thought it would be interesting to see how the writing goes without Jerry around anymore to fuck it up. How it goes. There is a prevailing misconception that people in the past were of a different breed than we, their lazy descendants, but it isn't true. People have always been fundamentally lazy, only doing what they absolutely have to do to get by. Nobody has ever wanted to have a job, employment by someone else for his amusement. However, here's the contradiction. If you work for yourself, you have no trouble working hard. This is especially true if your work is creative in nature. Actually, you're not lazy at all. It was people in the past that were lazy. No time for art, no. Just get your ass back on that line, buddy. You're lucky to have a job. I'll probably be dead by the time I achieve world recognition for my contribution to letters, so the likelihood that I will acquire a fan base large enough relative to my renown to support me in my accustomed luxury before I cease to exist as an independent consciousness is about as remote as that of an outhouse on Pluto, where even now a potential reader of my work awaits. That means, potential reader, that I will never know the life of aristocratic freedom which one must taste, even secondhand, in order to achieve truly world recognition-worthy great literature. I am tied to the role of the working man for the remainder of this drama. I don't hate the job so much as I hate having to do the job. Although the job, as far as what I am required to do, stinks, as a job compared to all the others available to someone with my limited skills and dubious paperwork trail, it isn't bad enough for me to complain about. It's not worth the emotional upheaval. I just continue with my secret ritual, take a deep breath, and smile. Keep smiling as you exhale. Keep smiling while you breathe several times. Smiling and relaxing are methods for fooling your brain into thinking you're happy. This will help you, not only to be actually happy, but forces you to confront your own self-awareness once again. This is good, for the more you dwell in the state of self-awareness, double awareness, some call it, the closer you come to being in that state all the time. Is it self-evident that the state of self-awareness, as you call it, is some kind of benefit or somehow representative of the absolute good? This question, directed at me during a televised seminar on the black arts, disturbed me for two reasons. First, it amazes me that at this level of technological sophistication we, as a society, as a species, still cling to this notion of absolute good and or absolute evil. Now, before I hash all that out, let me tell you the second reason. The last unhappy person in the world. Now, who would play him in the movie? It is, at this point, that the narrative on the old cassette tape ends, for the tape snapped off and just goes flapping around and around the spindle. Flap, 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 flap. Juicerale's Leperhead. In the Woolerbites' naive view of things, the Chuckawoolery era of Wheel of Fortune was a Periclean golden age when all the current problems with the show were precluded by high standards and rugged, harmless charm. Of course, it isn't true. The original Wheel was just as plagued by the endless worries about whether the puzzles are too hard. This problem is not made any less difficult by the notoriously tight budget on the show. At this point in the show's history, it is common practice to have the letter-turner woman double as a writer. Don't laugh at the notion of a pretty woman writing challenging word puzzles, show producer Ramirez Goblithely warns. Barbelia, our current letter-turner, thought of "by crooked shanks we go" and try another blender. The exact same thing happened to me. The only difference is that I maintained my self-awareness throughout. Now, I want to make clear that I acknowledge the growing use of the term double awareness. I have no objection to it. I understand and, in truth, further acknowledge that the term serves a useful purpose in delineating certain problematic areas with my choice of term. But that is the point. It is my choice of term, and as a man somewhat at odds with the current trajectory of history, I am yet a conservative to that tiny extent. However, I bow to the inevitable, whereas they bow to the Pope and his Sicilian messenger boy, Jesus Christ. These problems of which you speak, I reminded Mr. Goblithely. Could you elaborate on them? The young man seemed to be following the movements of a slow spider bus down in the labyrinthian avenues between the tufts and the rug. He bit the inside of his lips. I'll tell you, Lance, because I know you'll understand what I'm saying, and you'll put the whole thing in the proper context should you decide to relay this story and its exclusive details to others through as yet undecided media. He cleared his throat and adjusted his prescription shades. Sacramental oil freshly applied to Gander's leg. You must understand, Goblathley prefaced his statement, that a show this old has a history, a collection of traditions inviolable due to the weight of their clutches on the show. You, being a researcher on this very subject, know the list of successful shows that fell by the wayside because they tinkered with the formula. But how many? Goblathley wagged his finger in Socratic triumph. Do you know that went down because they tinkered with the intrinsic superstitions of the show? But the novelist, for such he was by now, pursed his lips and stared at some book about horses on the coffee table. Don't know, do you? Goblathley continued his examination. Well, no one does. That's because those superstitions are bound up into the foundations of any show, and tinkering with them would breed cancer. He was much older than the novelist had thought. As his voice wound down to a slow croak, Goblathley seemed absolutely expired. The novelist, whose pen name on this assignment was Solomon Kong, excused himself for a minute, claiming he needed to adjust the level on his recording device. Out in the hallway, Kong faced himself in a tall mirror. Initiating personality retrieval override, specifically relating to a maladjustment to recent formula changes. Initiating dial-tone frequency hiccup for self-denial. He began to breathe slowly, deliberately, each breath under observation, and then he began to smile. 1. Preference accounts for the fake horizon, he breathed out. 2. Benefiting loose haul bereft, he breathed out. Always out, always smiling. 3. Ravioli tomorrow endangering my comrades. Suddenly coming to himself, Solomon Kong, identifiable by his silly little hat, looked about warily, wolfishly, the man aware that he is dreaming and his dream has come to life. The wisest course of action would be to leave, jetzt. But Kong had left valuable notes and equipment in the room with Ramirez Goblethering's stupid name. Fuck it, Kong muttered in the simplified language of the animal man. He re-entered the room and found Annie Kohut sitting beside Goblathley. Hello, Moose, Kohut sang out. Goblathley, now unmasked as Dmitri Basiliscus, was refilling Kohut's glass with brandy. The false mustache, which Kong had suspected all along, lay in an ashtray at the man's elbow. Hello, Andy, Kong growled. He moved towards his bag. That your stuff? Kohut asked. Yeah, Kong replied flatly, grasping the handle. Don't worry about Kong, Basiliscus glanced into Kong's face. What did you call him? Moose? Moose is one of us now. A social club for solipsists. Kong felt confident enough to joke now that he had his bag in hand. Maybe they had tinkered with his bag. Maybe they understood its significance. Kong had no choice but to act on the assumption that they had not. Call it what you will, Basiliscus jabbed a finger at Kong, the bottle in that hand sloshing about, but you're a murderer just like the rest of us. Kong took a deep breath and smiled. I'll be seeing you two around, he said by way of farewell, stepping sideways and back, aiming for the door, but stepping into the shadows where he was swallowed up by the penumbrous minions of the blind syrup. To be truly happy is not to give a shit. Many people are willing to go that far. Not many people are willing to go that far, I proposed, when first the titular advice was offered to me. We call it reverse sainthood, the woman, whom I'll call Jill for the purpose of this experiment, added. Reverse sainthood, I repeated. We have another pamphlet on that. Jill set the term aside for now. I'm not going to try to con you with this, Lance, although she nodded towards the shelves of framed pictures. We do have some interesting lectures on multiple persona escapism in pursuit of so-called evil. She made a cute little face. I wondered how many times she had used it on the more knowing of the potential customers who wandered by her cart at the mall. Now, the thing is, I saw your comic strip in the umbrella. I was really impressed. Oh, well, thank you. I've been following it every week. The weekly pacing is much too slow. Once you see the work collected in book form, you'll feel the correct narrative flow. Do you have a book coming out? Through a series of corridors momentarily in alignment, and with all their facilitating doors open simultaneously, I could see all the way to the back of her surrounding membrane that she was truly interested. Now here's the question. Should I, potentially, disappoint her by telling her the truth? And remember, I've got to make this decision in a thin slice of a second. Or should I immediately default to a lie, which I rarely do out of sheer laziness? Today, for some reason, I went with the lie, and a rather elaborate one. Yes, I snapped my mouth shut with a smile, as if this affirmation were too wonderful to contain, leading so logically to my claim that the book was to be called Tonsillary Breakfast Condom, and that it would be published under the name of Patoadsgebot, and that the publisher, get this, was the same small press that first published Wright Morris. I had the name of the press, Bison Books, ready should she ask for it, but she never did. As I told you earlier, the euphoria of all this bullshit, I took her pamphlet As I told you earlier, in the euphoria of all this bullshit, I took her pamphlet on happiness. The title, To Be Truly Happy is Not to Give a Shit, stuck with me, and I've been debating it ever since. The above statement, made on behalf of me by legally dubious future attorneys, does not reflect the current attitude I have towards this work. Also, the overall interaction of the different genres of my work through shared characters and a theoretically proposed interconnected inner universe is, while a frighteningly real possibility, also an undesirable one at the time of this writing. I think I can admit to myself and to you that the book is over. I have not so much finished it or resolved it, so much as fleshed it out to a sufficient size for processing in the book form of a book, which to me is an actual goddamn physical object, something you can actually cut your finger on should you be so lucky as to have fingers still. And you can grasp my book, and you can heft it, and you can wonder, this is all going to be in my head soon. This discrete block of information and suggestion and seed work for later speculation is all going to be slowly absorbed. And if I read it again, I get more out of it a second time, because I see connections throughout it that I didn't understand before. And I wonder if the writer will write anything else.